Dercum's disease is a rare disorder in which the body forms acutely painful lipomas. In a healthy individual, small amounts of fluid containing toxins continually leak from blood vessels and are easily flushed out of the body. But in patients like Jake, for some unknown reason, too much fluid is released and settles between cells, creating inflammation. To clean up the toxic fluid, the body sends blood cells to the rescue. And to feed those cells, it produces fat, which gradually builds up into solid growths.
If you have a vessel that leaks fluid, that fluid should normally leave, but if it doesn't, then it's going to sit in that area and stay. It's like you take the garbage out to the street, but it never gets picked up by the garbage truck. So it starts to almost ferment in the tissue. It becomes more and more toxic, and it sends signals out to cells called macrophages to come in and clean up the mess. They eat up all of the garbage that's in the tissue. These macrophages need to have food themselves. So the fat in the areas of the lipoma most likely grows in order to feed the cells that have accumulated in that tissue itself.
My gut reaction to finding out that I actually had Dercum's disease was to jump up and cheer. I was really happy that I found out what was wrong with me.
I thought about where we were going to go from here. I was hopeful for the future.
While much about Dercum's is a mystery, Dr. Herbst is one of the world's foremost experts on it, and she suspects that Jake may be genetically predisposed to the disease.
My understanding is likely there's been a mutation in a gene that's passed down amongst family members, and that causes the blood vessels and fat tissue to respond differently to inflammation.
Dr. Herbst also has a theory about what triggered the onset of Dercum's in Jake's case.
He had just undergone boot camp and an extreme amount of physical activity. When you undergo physical activity, you produce a lot of lactic acid, and then it's taken to the liver and it's metabolized. Well, in someone who has Dercum's disease, the lactic acid is released outside of the cell, but then it just sits there.
And the more Jake exercised, the worse his symptoms became. But surprisingly, they improved during the hot summer in South Carolina.
The heat probably helps Jake because it dilates the blood vessels, and dilation actually draws more fluid from the tissue back into the blood vessels, and it gives a little bit of relief to the nerves during that period of time.
But even physicians on the cutting edge of research like Dr. Herbst don't understand why Dercum's is so painful. However, she can explain why the lipomas multiplied when Jake had them surgically excised.
When you remove the lipoma, you leave behind an area of inflammation. Whenever there's inflammation, there's an over-responsiveness of the body. Inflammation in the area of surgery stimulates leakage and fluid to accumulate. So having lipomas removed in Dercum's disease causes a vicious cycle of growth of fat.
Despite the harsh reality of the disease, Jake is aware that his prognosis would have been dire if he hadn't been diagnosed when he was.
The worst case scenario with Dercum's disease is somebody who is unable to handle the excess amount of fluid in their body. So as the fluid builds up over time, it also fills up in the lung, and that can actually lead to death.
The grim truth is there's no medication that can shrink the lipomas, and no surgery that will permanently remove them.
Unfortunately, there is no cure for Dercum's disease.
This is a lifelong problem, so these should continue to grow over time.
When the realization hit that Jake was going to have to live with this disease for the rest of his life, and that the lumps were going to continue to multiply, it's devastating.
I wanted to cry because I knew that this was going to be a long, hard battle.
But Dr. Herbst also has some good news for Jake and Heidi. There are ways that they can manage the symptoms.
I can make a number of recommendations to possibly decrease some of the fluid in his tissue and enable Jake to have as long of a life as somebody who doesn't have Dercum's disease. He should avoid physical activity, and he needs to decrease the amount of stress in his life.
He has to change every aspect of his life.
While Jake is grateful to finally know how to cope with his devastating condition, He can't help but wonder why no other doctor was able to give him a solid diagnosis.
We really don't receive education on how to diagnose fat disorders. A doctor would look at it and say, you have multiple lipomas, don't worry about it, go on home.
Today, Jake is bravely living with his condition. Unfortunately, he may have to give up the job that has meant so much to him.
I really don't want to leave the Air Force, but I'm not able to do all the physical things that I was before.
Jake's case is currently under medical review to determine whether or not he'll be able to continue serving in the military. In the meantime, Jake and Heidi are focused on raising their family. They now have 2 children.
It's really important to me to be a role model for my kids. As a father, my sons especially look up to me.
I know that this is something that is going to be with us forever, and I really hate that for him.
My wife and I recently just counted again. I'm up to 815 lipomas now. Currently, I'm taking 2 different kinds of pain medicine. It helps me be able to perform everyday tasks like pick my kid up. And so the medications have definitely helped with stuff like that.
Despite the uncertainties they face, Jake and Heidi are closer than ever.
Everything that's happened has made our marriage so much stronger, and it made me love him so much more.
I had learned always search for the answer that fits for you best. Never give up and try to stay positive.
We're optimistic about the future. We're going to try to make the best of what we've been given.